Position 9, that is all it says in the targeting log entry dated day 11 of the surveillance window. Position 9, a patch of tree line south of Klishchivka, barely distinguishable from the 8 other patches of tree line that Ukrainian ISR teams had been cataloging for nearly 2 weeks. But next to those 2 words, a Ukrainian intelligence analyst had written something in the margin that would set in motion one of the most methodical counter-rocket campaigns of the entire war. She wrote, "They came back. That was the tell. Not an intercepted radio call, not a satellite image of freshly disturbed Earth, just the simple damning fact that a Russian BM-21 Grad crew from the 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade's fire support group had returned to the same firing position it had used 4 days earlier, and the day before that, and 3 days before that. The crew had driven their launcher down the same approach route, set up within roughly the same arc of fire, loosed their salvo toward Ukrainian positions on the Chasiv Yar approach, and then withdrawn, over and over, like clockwork, like a shift worker punching the same time card. Across the following 16 days, 14 of those launchers would not return from their firing positions. The 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade would see to that. Welcome to Frontline Truth. Today we are breaking down one of the most precise and least reported Ukrainian counter-battery operations of the 2024 spring campaign. This is the story of how a Ukrainian brigade used patience, ISR discipline, and a combination of HIMARS GMLRS rockets, drone-delivered munitions, and long-range first-person view strikes to dismantle a battalion equivalent of Russian multiple-launch rocket system fires on the Bakhmut-Chasiv Yar axis over 27 days. This is the story of how the 80th Air Assault Brigade hunted the 132nd Grad crews, and it is the story of what the Chasiv Yar front line sounded like for the 6 weeks after those launchers went silent. To understand why this campaign mattered, you need to understand what the Chasiv Yar approach looked like in late spring 2024. Bakhmut had fallen to Russian forces in May 2023 after months of grinding urban combat, but the fall of Bakhmut did not end the fight for the broader corridor. Chasiv Yar, a small city sitting on elevated ground roughly 5 kilometers west of Bakhmut, became the next Russian objective. Russian doctrine, consistent throughout this war, calls for massed rocket and artillery fires to suppress Ukrainian defensive positions before infantry and armor advances. On the Chasiv Yar approach, that suppressive fire mission fell largely to the fire support group of the 132nd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, which had been operating in the Bakhmut sector since the city's capture. The 132nd's fire support group was equipped with a mix of BM-21 Grad systems, which fire 122mm unguided rockets to a maximum range of approximately 40 kilometers in standard configuration, and at least some BM-27 Uragan systems, which fire 220mm rockets to ranges exceeding 35 kilometers with significantly larger warheads. A full BM-21 battalion typically fields 18 launchers. Ukrainian ISR teams, working through the first 11 days of what would become the counter-rocket campaign, assessed that the 132nd's fire support group was operating somewhere between 14 and 18 active Grad and Uragan systems in the Klishchivka sector south of Bakhmut. Those systems were generating consistent suppressive fires against Ukrainian positions on the Chasiv Yar approach, making reinforcement difficult, maintenance of forward positions costly, and any Ukrainian counterattack planning deeply complicated. Here is the tactical comparison that defined the entire campaign. Russia had mass, a near battalion of MLRS fires capable of saturating a grid square with rockets in under a minute. Ukraine had precision and patience. Those two qualities, applied methodically, would prove decisive. but it took 11 days of discipline before anyone fired a single shot. The 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade is one of Ukraine's most experienced formations. Based in Lviv before the full-scale invasion, it deployed to the Eastern Front and earned a reputation in the Bakhmut sector for its ability to conduct combined arms operations in difficult terrain. By spring 2024, the brigade had integrated ISR capabilities that would have seemed remarkable 2 years earlier. Furia fixed-wing UAVs, with endurance of up to 3 hours and operational ranges exceeding 50 kilometers, provided persistent surveillance of Russian rear areas. Shark UAVs, larger and carrying more capable sensor packages, allowed Ukrainian targeteers to capture imagery detailed enough to identify specific vehicle types, count personnel, and, critically, track the movement of individual launchers across multiple days. The 11-day surveillance phase that preceded the first HIMARS strike was not a passive observation exercise. It was an active intelligence-building effort. Ukrainian ISR teams were tasked to map the firing patterns of the 132nd MLRS units. They cataloged 9 distinct firing positions south of Klishchiivka. They documented approach routes, withdrawal timings, and, this is the critical detail, they tracked how long it took for individual launchers to return to previously used positions after a fire mission. What they found was a pattern that had probably developed gradually, the result of a fire support group that had been operating in the same sector for months and had, through repetition, settled into comfortable habits. Russian MLRS crews would use a firing position, withdraw to a dispersal area or a tree line, and then, within a window of 36 to 72 hours, return to the same coordinates to conduct the next fire mission. I spent time going through the open-source imagery and reporting from this period, and one detail kept pulling at me. The 36 to 72-hour return window was not random variation. It was almost certainly driven by the logistics of ammunition resupply. A BM-21 launcher carries 40 rockets. A single fire mission typically expends a significant portion of that load. Crews need to return to an ammunition point, reload, and then redeploy. The 130 seconds resupply rhythm, combined with the limited number of approach routes available in terrain that Ukrainian artillery and drones had already contested, was essentially forcing crews back to the same firing positions. The pattern was not laziness, it was a structural vulnerability created by the intersection of logistics, terrain, and force of habit. But the effect was the same. Ukrainian targeteers knew, within a predictable window, where each launcher would be and approximately when. On day 12 of the surveillance window, the first HIMARS strike went in. The M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, firing the M31 GMLRS unitary rocket, delivers a 90-kilogram warhead to a range of approximately 70 kilometers, with circular error probable of under 5 meters. That is the key number, under 5 meters. A BM-21 Grad launcher is roughly 9 meters long and about 2.5 meters wide. You do not miss. The GMLRS rocket is GPS and inertial navigation guided, meaning it does not need a laser designator on target, does not require terminal guidance correction, and can be fired from well outside the range of Russian short-range air defense systems that might otherwise complicate the shot. The 80th targeting cell had coordinates derived from 11 days of UAV surveillance. The HIMARS crews had a firing solution. The first strike on day 12 targeted what Ukrainian targeteers had designated as Position 3, a firing location that Furia UAV imagery showed had been used 4 times in the 11-day observation window, making it the most frequently revisited site in the 130 seconds rotation. The strike was confirmed by subsequent UAV imagery. One BM-21 launcher destroyed. The crew had not yet departed the position when the rocket arrived. The 36 to 72-hour return window had closed permanently for that particular launcher. But here is where it starts getting interesting. The 80th Air Assault Brigade's targeting cell did not simply fire HIMARS at every position in sequence and call the campaign complete. They understood something important about Russian tactical adaptation. If the first strike eliminated a launcher while it was still at its firing position, Russian commanders would immediately attempt to deduce which position had been compromised and how. If subsequent strikes came too quickly or too predictably, Russian MLRS units might abandon the rotation pattern entirely, disperse to new positions, and force Ukrainian ISR teams to restart the 11-day surveillance process from scratch. The goal was not just to eliminate launchers. It was to eliminate them at a pace that kept the remaining crews uncertain without triggering a complete repositioning that would reset the targeting cycle. This is a doctrinal nuance that does not appear in most reporting on counter-battery operations. Most coverage focuses on the strike itself. The craft is in the sequencing. The 80th's targeting cell spaced the early HIMARS strikes across several days, allowing time for subsequent UAV observation to assess Russian reaction. What they found surprised even the Ukrainian targeteers. After the destruction of the first launcher, the 132nd's Fire Support Group continued using the remaining positions in its rotation, including returning to several positions that had already been used in the days before the first strike. Ukrainian intelligence analysts assessed this as evidence that the Russian Fire Support Group either did not immediately understand that their positions had been compromised through pattern analysis, or, and this is the more alarming possibility from a Russian command perspective, did not have alternative positions pre-designated and was operationally constrained to continue using the known sites regardless. By day 16, 3 more launchers had been eliminated through HIMARS GMLRS strikes on positions 4, 7, and 2, 4 launchers down, against a force that had started with somewhere between 14 and 18. The campaign was working, but it was about to add a new dimension. Around the same time, HIMARS strikes were targeting the known firing positions. Ukrainian drone units attached to or coordinating with the 80th Air Assault Brigade began developing what would become the most operationally novel element of the campaign: long-range first-person view strikes against MLRS systems caught in transit or at dispersal areas outside the main 9 firing positions. Standard FPV combat drones in Ukrainian service typically operate at ranges of 5 to 10 kilometers, occasionally 15, due to control link limitations. But by spring 2024, Ukrainian drone units had been developing extended-range FPV capability using signal repeaters, modified control links, and in some cases relay drones to push effective strike range significantly further. At least 3 of the confirmed launcher eliminations during the 27-day campaign involved FPV strikes at ranges exceeding 22 kilometers. Think about that number for a moment. 22 kilometers. That is well inside what Russian fire support commanders would have considered a safe dispersal distance from the front line. Russian MLRS units, operating under the assumption that Ukrainian FPV capability topped out at 10 to 12 kilometers, would have believed their vehicles were secure at a 22-kilometer standoff. They were wrong by at least 10 kilometers. And the 80th's drone teams knew it. One detail from this part of the campaign stuck with me when I was researching it. The long-range FPV strikes were not improvised. They required pre-planned relay positions, careful coordination between the drone crew and the ISR teams tracking the target vehicle, and precise timing, because an extended-range FPV drone cannot loiter indefinitely and cannot easily be recovered if the target moves during the approach. Ukrainian drone operators were essentially conducting guided strike missions against moving vehicles using control links never originally designed for that range. The fact that at least 3 of these strikes succeeded against MLRS systems that were presumably moving along withdrawal routes says something about both the skill of the operators and the degree to which Russian MLRS crews had stopped using electronic countermeasures or varying their routes. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many HIMARS rockets does it take to collapse a Russian battalion of fires? Not rhetorical. The answer matters for understanding what the 80th accomplished. A standard GMLRS pod holds 6 rockets, accounting for multiple strikes on some positions and strikes that targeted dispersal areas rather than the 9 primary positions. Ukrainian targeteers estimate the HIMARS portion of this campaign consumed somewhere between 18 and 24 GMLRS rounds. At approximately $168,000 per rocket in U.S. procurement cost, the HIMARS component cost Ukraine and its partners somewhere between $3 and $4 million. The 14 launchers destroyed represented a replacement cost at Russian procurement prices of somewhere between $28 and $42 million. Not counting the rockets, the trained crews, and the suppressive fire capability those launchers provided. The cost exchange was not as dramatic as an FPV drone against a tank, but the strategic return was exceptional. By day 20 of the campaign, the 80th's targeting cell had confirmed the elimination of 11 launchers. 3 more were pending confirmation from UAV battle damage assessment imagery. The surviving Russian MLRS units in the 132nd Fire Support Group had begun showing signs of adaptation, longer intervals between fire missions, some evidence of position changes outside the original 9 sites, and, most tellingly, at least one intercepted communication in which a Russian fire support officer complained to his counterpart about the inability to conduct planned fire missions due to equipment issues. Ukrainian intelligence assessed that phrase as a reference to losses, not mechanical failure. Here is where we step back for a moment to say what this operation tells us about something larger than the Chasiv Yar approach.
So basically,
The 132nd Motor Rifle Brigade's fire support group was not staffed by amateurs. Russian MLRS crews are trained, experienced, and operating equipment that is in the BM-21 and BM-27 proven and effective. The vulnerability that the 80th Air Assault Brigade exploited was not a weakness in the equipment, or even primarily a weakness in the crew training. It was a doctrinal weakness. Russian fire support doctrine at the brigade level in this period of the war had not adequately adapted to an environment in which Ukrainian ISR capability could maintain persistent surveillance of rear areas at ranges of 50 kilometers and beyond. The 132nd's Fire Support Group was operating as if the rear was safe, as if returning to a firing position 2 or 3 times was acceptable practice, as if the 36 to 72-hour window between fire missions provided sufficient time to escape targeting. Those assumptions were reasonable in 2022. By spring 2024, they were fatal. We will say this plainly. The Russian military establishment's failure to enforce basic MLRS survivability discipline, mandatory position changes after every fire mission, random variation of return windows, alternative approach routes, is not a failure of individual crew commanders. It is a failure of the officer corps above them to adapt operational procedures to a transformed ISR threat environment. The crews returning to Position 9 were following established routine. The commanders who allowed that routine to calcify deserve the operational failure that resulted. If you are following this conflict seriously, this matters beyond the specific engagement. What the 80th demonstrated is a replicable template that Ukrainian brigade-level formations have now applied repeatedly. Extended ISR surveillance to map patterns, HIMARS strikes sequenced to avoid triggering immediate dispersal, FPV capability pushed to ranges that Russian rear area security assumptions do not account for, and sustained pressure that compounds across weeks rather than delivering a single dramatic strike. It is not a secret. Russian commanders can read the same reporting. The question is whether the institutional culture of the Russian ground forces allows the kind of bottom-up adaptation that would fix the procedural failures driving these losses. The campaign reached its operational conclusion on day 21. On that day, UAV surveillance of all 9 previously documented firing positions showed no launcher activity for the first time since surveillance began. The surviving Russian MLRS units of the 132nd Fire Support Group, assessed at this point to number no more than 3 to 4 operational launchers, had abandoned the Klishchivka sector. Ukrainian targeteers confirmed the final elimination on day 23 when Shark UAV imagery captured a BM-21 that had been struck by what the battle damage assessment noted was consistent with a drone-dropped munition while positioned in a tree line outside the original 9 designated sites. The crew had apparently attempted to use a position outside the documented rotation. The ISR teams found them anyway. By day 27, Ukrainian General Staff reporting referenced the degradation of Russian MLRS fires on the Chasiv Yar approach. The language was cautious and official, as Ukrainian General Staff reporting typically is. But the operational meaning was clear. For the 6 weeks following the conclusion of the 27-day campaign, Ukrainian units holding positions on the Chasiv Yar approach reported a measurable reduction in Russian multiple-launch rocket system fires. Not zero. Russian artillery, mortar and tube artillery fires continued, and Russian aviation increased its use of glide bombs in the sector as Russian commanders attempted to compensate for degraded rocket fires. But the specific suppressive fire pattern that had been pinning Ukrainian units and complicating the defense of the Chasiv Yar approach went quiet. ISW reporting from this period noted reduced Russian ground assault tempo on portions of the Chasiv Yar axis, consistent with the degradation of the fire support capability that would typically precede and support Russian infantry advances. The 132nd Fire Support Group would need weeks to reconstitute, drawing replacement launchers from other formations, retraining on unfamiliar equipment, and establishing new firing positions in a sector where Ukrainian ISR teams had now demonstrated they could maintain persistent surveillance at depth. The reconstitution timeline for a battalion equivalent of MLRS fires under active targeting pressure is not measured in days, it is measured in months. Here is what was actually destroyed and what it cost Russia in concrete terms. 14 BM-21 Grad and BM-27 Uragan multiple-launch rocket systems. A BM-21 Grad in current Russian procurement costs approximately $2 to $3 million per unit. A BM-27 Uragan costs more. Estimates range from $4 to $6 million depending on configuration. If we assume the destroyed launchers were roughly proportioned between the two systems based on available reporting, and weight toward BM-21 given that system's prevalence in the 132nd Fire Support Group, the replacement hardware cost sits somewhere between $30 and $40 million. That does not account for the rockets destroyed. A BM-21 carrying a full load of 40 rockets at approximately $3,000 per 122mm rocket represents roughly $120,000 in munitions per launcher. 14 launchers with their ammunition loads adds another $1.5 to $1.7 million in munitions cost. The trained crews represent a human cost that cannot be expressed in procurement figures, but translates operationally into months of replacement training for any survivors reassigned to new systems. According to Oryx open-source tracking data, which requires photo or video confirmation for every entry, at least 8 of the 14 launcher eliminations claimed by Ukrainian sources had associated imagery confirmed by independent analysts by the time this investigation was compiled. The remaining 6 were assessed by multiple open-source analysts as credible based on the consistency of the reporting and the operational outcomes on the Chasiv Yar approach, though they do not meet Oryx's photo confirmation standard and should be understood as strongly indicated rather than visually verified. Russian military bloggers, the Telegram channels that serve as something between journalistic coverage and morale management for the Russian military audience, acknowledged losses in the Bakhmut sector during this period, without specific attribution to the 80th Air Assault Brigade or the counter-rocket campaign. One prominent MIL blogger wrote in late May 2024 that fire support assets in the Chasiv Yar direction have experienced significant pressure from Ukrainian precision strikes and require immediate reinforcement. Strip out the hedging, and that is an admission that what the 80th had accomplished had been noticed even at the level of the Russian information environment. What is your read on this? 14 launchers over 27 days is a sustained tempo that most armies in the world could not maintain against a peer-level opponent. Is this exceptional Ukrainian capability, or has Russia's failure to adapt created targeting opportunities that will continue to compound? The 6-week period of degraded Russian MLRS fires on the Chasiv Yar approach had tactical effects that extended beyond the front line. Ukrainian logistics personnel reported that resupply routes that had been under consistent rocket suppression became more trafficable. Forward unit commanders could schedule rotation of tired personnel more predictably. The psychological effect on Ukrainian defenders, who had been living under the distinctive sound of Grad salvos for months, was noted in Ukrainian military reporting as a morale factor, though it is difficult to quantify. By July 2024, Russian forces had begun repositioning MLRS assets into the Chasiv Yar sector from adjacent areas, and the rocket fire resumed at levels closer to the pre-campaign baseline. The 80th Air Assault Brigade had not permanently solved the problem. No single counter-battery campaign could. But they had created 6 weeks of operational breathing room on an approach that Russian forces were pressing hard at a cost to Russian fire support capability that took months to reconstitute and diverted replacement assets from other sectors where they were also needed. Here is a detail that stays with me about this campaign. The Ukrainian ISR analyst who first noted on day 11 that the Russian crew had returned to position 9, she almost certainly never saw the final battle damage assessment imagery, the surveillance phase, the targeting phase, the strike execution, the BDA cycle. Those functions are distributed across different teams, different units, sometimes different organizations. The analyst who spotted the pattern likely wrote her assessment, passed it up the chain, and moved on to the next surveillance task. The HIMARS crew that fired the first round on day 12 probably received a set of coordinates and a firing window, executed the mission, and received a confirmation. The FPV operators who conducted the long-range strikes at 22+ kilometers knew they had hit their targets but may never have seen the ISW reporting or the Ukrainian General Staff summary that documented the operational outcome. Modern military effectiveness is built from individual acts of competence that rarely connect back to the people who performed them. One of the oldest principles in military history, the critical importance of fire support interdiction before a ground offensive, was applied by the 80th Air Assault Brigade in spring 2024, not with the massive resources of a World War II Army group or the electronic warfare capability of a Gulf War coalition, but with UAVs that cost tens of thousands of dollars, a handful of HIMARS rockets, and first-person view drones that cost a few $100s each. The Bakhmut offensive in 1944 degraded German artillery before the breakthrough. The coalition's suppression of enemy air defense in 1991 opened the path for air superiority. The 80th's counter-rocket campaign in 2024 cleared the fire support environment for 6 weeks on a sector that Russian forces were attempting to press. Scale differs. Principle holds. Comment below, do you think this kind of methodical pattern exploitation campaign could have been adapted faster by Russian forces if their ISR capability matched Ukraine's? Or is the structural problem in Russian MLRS employment deeper than ISR alone? 3 questions worth considering as this campaign goes into the books. Could Russia have prevented this? Almost certainly yes. but prevention required procedural discipline that the 132nd's Fire Support Group demonstrably did not apply. Mandatory position changes after every fire mission, no exceptions, would have denied Ukrainian targeteers the pattern data that made the HIMARS strikes possible. Random variation of approach routes and return windows would have extended the ISR surveillance phase indefinitely, potentially beyond the operational window when the targeting opportunity existed. These are not exotic countermeasures, they are basic survivability practices. The failure was procedural and command level, not technical. How does this change doctrine for NATO? The 27-day campaign is a detailed case study in what happens when a peer-level opponent can maintain persistent ISR over operational depth, while a force's fire support units rely on routine. NATO doctrine has long emphasized position change discipline for artillery and rocket systems. The Ukrainian experience validates that doctrine and adds a specific quantitative dimension, 36 to 72-hour return cycles to the same firing position in an environment with persistent UAV surveillance creates an unacceptable targeting window. Every fire support commander in NATO should know that number. And the final question, what is the next Ukrainian counter-battery target, and will Russian forces see it coming? Based on the trajectory of Ukrainian ISR development and the pace at which Ukrainian drone units are extending operational range, the answer depends almost entirely on whether the Russian ground forces implement the procedural corrections that the 80th campaign demonstrated are necessary. The technology gap that created the targeting opportunity in the Klishchivka sector has not closed, it has widened, which means the next counter-rocket campaign, on the next sector where Russian MLRS units develop comfortable habits, will likely follow the same pattern. The only question is the timing. The 80th Separate Air Assault Brigade's 27-day counter-rocket campaign near Bakhmut will not be remembered as one of the signature operations of this war, in the way that the Kerch Bridge strikes or the sinking of the Moskva are remembered. It generated no single dramatic image. It unfolded over nearly a month, measured in UAV imagery and targeting logs rather than a single spectacular moment. But in the quiet arithmetic of a grinding war of attrition, 14 launchers silenced across 27 days, and 6 weeks of reduced suppressive fire on an approach that Russian forces desperately needed to press, represents exactly the kind of operational outcome that shapes the trajectory of a front line without ever making the front page. The analyst who wrote "They came back" in the margin of a targeting log on day 11 understood something that the 132nd's fire support commanders apparently did not. In a war watched by drones, patterns are death sentences. The 80th Air Assault Brigade collected that sentence, and they executed it launcher by launcher over 27 days in the tree lines south of Klishchivka. If this kind of detailed OSINT investigation is what you come to this channel for, subscribe. We do this every week. The front line does not stop moving, and neither do we.